quote. And here I'm just going to paste Surah 105. Well, there it is. ChatGPT has just produced what it believes is a Surah-like text modeled after Surah 105. A secret so unsettling, so deeply buried, that Muslim apologists like Hijab will never bring it up. Buried deep in Islamic history and even within the Quran itself is a mysterious story. A story of 3 pagan deities, a prophet, and a shocking revelation that was once part of Orthodox Islam, but has since been swept under the rug. What is this story, and why is it so dangerous to Islam's credibility? Let's start with a couple verses from the Quran, verses that mention 3 pagan deities. Surah 53:19. Have you considered Al-Lat and Al-Uzza and Manat, the third one, the other? These 2 short verses may not look like much at first glance, but they are some of the most puzzling in the entire Quran. They name 3 pagan deities, Lat, Uzza, and Manat, worshipped by the Quraysh tribe in pre-Islamic Arabia. Why would the Quran, a book that repeatedly condemns idol worship, mention these gods in such an ambiguous way? And what's even stranger, after the Quran mentions these 3 pagan deities, Lat, Uzza, and Manat, you might expect an immediate and forceful condemnation, declaring them to be false gods. After all, Islam is supposed to be the purest form of monotheism, but that's not what happens. Instead, the very next verse shifts focus entirely. Is the male for you, and for him the female? This verse criticizes the Quraysh for attributing female names to angels, a seemingly unrelated point that feels sort of out of step with the gravity of the preceding verses. Why doesn't the Quran denounce these gods outright? Why this sudden pivot to an issue about angels? It's a strange detour that raises even more questions about the meaning of Lat, Uzza, and Manat in this passage, and why these names were invoked at all. Now,
this just utterly exposes your ignorance on Islam. You want to speak to us about this supposed satanic verses incident, and yet you can't even get basic information right in this video. Truly embarrassing. These 3 pagan deities you mentioned were worshipped as female daughters to Allah, you jahil.
The male for you, and for him the female. This verse criticizes the Quraysh for attributing female names to angels, a seemingly unrelated point that feels sort of out of step with the gravity of the preceding verses. Why doesn't the Quran denounce these gods outright? Why this sudden pivot to an issue about angels? It's a strange detour that raises even more questions about the meaning of Lat, Uzza, and Manat in.
And since you included Muhammad Hijab in your video, I'm gonna have to do it to you. You can't even do basic research, boy.
My brother, I'm not gonna call you brother. Boy.
So these verses that come after are condemnation that is reminiscent to previously revealed verses like what's found in chapter 37, verse 149. And since you love early Muslim interpretation so much, the earliest Quran commentary, Muqattil bin Sulaiman, says that these verses in Surah Al-Najm that you mentioned, that came after the mentioning of Al-Lat, Al-Uzza, and Manat, he says that these are the angels that are attributed as being female. Okay guys, so this is future me. While I was editing this video, I actually decided to read the book that Cameron talked about, and I take back what I say in the video later on concerning the Harvard professor doing really bad research or making really bad arguments, because it turns out it's just Cameron's incompetency, because the whole book refutes Cameron. This is just one example. In this example, Shahab, the author of the book, actually refutes Cameron on the verses in Surah Al-Najm seemingly being disconnected. He says exactly what I say about them being connected, that the angels that are the daughters of Allah are in reference here to Al-Lat, Al-Uzza, and Manat. And as you see, I'm going to continue to do this because I just read the whole book. So please make sure you like, make sure you subscribe. And if you do want to support me, it's the link in the descriptions. But this is going to get really, really crazy. The amount of times that Cameron actually conflicts with the author of the book, it's absolutely crazy.
These verses were delivered during a critical moment in Muhammad's life. He faced growing opposition from his tribe, the Quraysh, who fiercely defended their ancestral gods. The stakes were high, and Muhammad's mission was hanging in the balance. But what happened next is one of the most controversial moments in Islamic history. Something so significant, it would later be rewritten, reinterpreted, and eventually suppressed. To uncover the truth, we need to go back to some of the earliest Islamic sources. The year is 615 AD, and Mecca is at a crossroads. Muhammad's mission is in jeopardy. His message of monotheism has alienated the Quraysh, the dominant tribe that clings fiercely to their ancient gods, Lat, Uzza, and Manat. These 3 goddesses are the cornerstone of their worship and identity. For years, Muhammad's denunciation of their gods has only intensified the hostility. His followers are few, his influence is fragile, the pressure to compromise is mounting. And then, something extraordinary happens. The early Islamic sources, Ibn Ishaq, Tabari, and Ibn Sa'id, describe a pivotal public recitation of Surah 53, the Star. The Quraysh.
So yeah, again, I called Cameron out. The author of the book himself mentions how problematic Ibn Ishaq is as being a source. All of the sources he quoted are history books. They contain contradictory accounts in there, and many of the narrations there are weak and disconnected in their proper chains. The main purpose of these historians preserving these narrations is for people to later grade them. So all they're doing is hearing what's around them and then are reporting with no thoughts about the authenticity in mind. Tabari mentions this at the very beginning of his book. If you had just opened it, you would have seen that. So you can't even do your own research. Boy.
Who call you brother? Boy.
Later scholars who assessed the strength of these narrations, such as Ibn Kathir and Qadi Iyad, found that there was no narration that was connected to an eyewitness, meaning there's no hadith that met the standard of being authentic, and therefore there is no reason for us to take the story to be authentic. The ones that are authentic about the Prophet reciting chapter 53 are found in both Bukhari and Muslim, where the mentioning of the satanic verses are completely absent.
But curious to hear Muhammad speak. His voice resonates through the crowd. Have you considered Lat and Uzza and Manat, the third, the other? The Quraysh brace for what comes next, another condemnation of their gods? Instead, Muhammad continues with words that leave them stunned. These are the exalted cranes whose intercession is to be hoped for. For the first time, Muhammad's words appear to affirm the power and status of the Quraysh's deities. The tension in the air evaporates. According to these sources, the Quraysh are so moved by this acknowledgement that they prostrate alongside Muhammad. For a brief moment, the bitter divide between them seems to heal. Peace, it seems, is finally within reach. But this triumph is short-lived. Days later, Muhammad shocked his followers and the Quraysh by retracting the verses, claiming that they had not come from Allah, but from Satan. According to Ibn Ishaq, Jibril, known in Islamic tradition as the angel Gabriel, who delivers divine revelations, confronted Muhammad, exposing the deception. Quote, Jibril came to the messenger and said, Muhammad, what have you done? You have recited to the people that which I did not bring to you from God, and you have said that which he did not say to you. Muhammad was absolutely devastated, but he claimed God provided reassurance through another revelation. Quote, we have not sent before you a messenger or a prophet, but that when he desired, Satan cast something into his desire. Then God removes that which Satan casts and establishes his signs clearly. This new revelation amounts to a startling admission. Muhammad himself acknowledged that Satan had successfully influenced his words. The phrase, Satan cast something into his desire, explicitly confirms that Satan exploited Muhammad's internal thoughts and wishes, his longing to reconcile with his tribe, the Quraysh, to infiltrate what he believed to be divine revelation. More devout Muslim historians record this incident. Why include a story so embarrassing, one that casts Muhammad as fallible, even deceived? To answer this, we turn to the groundbreaking work of Shahab Ahmed, a highly respected Muslim scholar whose credentials are impeccable. Ahmed, who taught at Harvard University, dedicated his life to the study of Islamic history and theology. His book...
Well, so because he studied at Harvard and has a Muslim-sounding name, then we should really take him seriously, right? Let's see the substance of his argument on why he thinks it's authentic, shall we?
For Orthodoxy, published by the prestigious Harvard University Press, meticulously examines over 50 early Islamic sources that document the Satanic verses incident. These are accounts written by Islam's critics. They're drawn from within the tradition itself.
Even if there were 50 independent chains, if they all don't go back to a prophet with an eyewitness to the event, then there's no reason to take it as authentic. And we have eyewitnesses to the event not mentioning it as I explained before. Because all these narrations are disconnected or weak, all it takes is one liar to have all these chains come from him. And we will get into this really weak argument that this guy brings to have us think that the story couldn't have had been made up.
Again, if this story is false, why would the earliest Muslims invent it? Fabricating such an event would mean creating a narrative that severely undermines Muhammad's credibility, essentially sabotaging their own cause. This is why Ahmed's work is so important. His research highlights a historical principle that's difficult to ignore, the principle of embarrassment. Historians recognize that the more damaging a story is to its subject, the more likely it is to be true. In this story, it's about as damaging as it gets. No Muslim would invent a tale that undermines their own prophet's credibility, unless they're grappling with events that actually happened.
Okay guys, so this is gonna be the last time you guys are gonna hear from me in the future. This is the most damning part. Cameron rests his case on the criteria of embarrassment mainly. The author of this book never makes the case that because there's so many narrations, therefore it's authentic. Actually, Shahab is merely showing that the early Muslims didn't have a problem in accepting this because they accepted things within the Quran where the Prophet made mistakes. He makes the case that there's a later idea of the fact that the Prophet couldn't sin and the Prophet couldn't make mistakes, which obviously Ibn Taymiyyah holds to this view as well, that it is possible that this incident did occur. However, the fact of the matter is it's just inauthentic. But to believe that this would invalidate the message had it been authentic, now that's a view that the early Muslims didn't hold to because of the fact that Allah had rectified the message. This completely debunks Cameron's point now, and Muslims could have potentially fabricated this story in the context where it wouldn't be embarrassing, and that's clearly found within Shahab's book multiple times. Let me read a couple passages here. On page 295, the fact that the early reports of the Satanic verses incident do not make any attempt to explain how it is that the Prophet could confuse Satanic inspiration for divine revelation suggests that the narrators of the incident felt no need to offer such an explanation to their early Muslim audiences. The reason for this can be only that the early Muslims did not need such an explanation.
they were already culturally disposed, that is, conceptually and cognitively disposed, to accept this idea. And the cherry on top is his conclusion. This is literally like the last passage in his whole book, which is precisely the question that we have not set out to answer. Did the incident actually take place? In light of the fact that the Muslim community of the first 2 centuries of Islam overwhelmingly accepted the historicity of the Satanic verses incident, it's hard to see how it could have been fabricated and introduced into Muslim discourse by early enemies of Islam. Islamic orthodoxy has argued. Orientalists have insisted that Muslims could not have possibly invented such an inauspicious story. We have seen, however, that early Muslim discourse did not view the Satanic verses incident as objectionable or even as merely unobjectionable, but rather that the incident is illustrative of the standard understanding of Muhammad's prophethood among early Muslims. There is presumably no reason, therefore, why they could not have made it up. Man, Cameron, just retire. Retire at this point, bro. Orientalists say there's no way Muslims could have fabricated it because it's quite embarrassing, basically what Cameron's saying here. But Shahab is refuting that very notion, saying that early Muslims didn't find it embarrassing. So it's very possible they would have fabricated this, like many other stories, to add more narratives to the Prophet's life.
You see, that is such a weak and flimsy argument. The criteria of embarrassment is one of the weakest forms of evidences used in argumentation when examining history, and I'll show you why. What you consider to be embarrassing is highly subjective. You're not living in the society at the time of the spreading of this narration, nor do you understand the psychology of the person that's narrating this event. And actually, there's good reason to think the one who fabricated this story did not find it embarrassing, but rather useful to portray some information. I can think of a whole list of reasons why this wouldn't be considered embarrassing for them. This highlights God's protection of the Prophet from the meddling of the devil, and shows that the Prophet, peace be upon him, isn't the one who protects himself from the devil, but rather Allah is the one who protects him, highlighting Allah Azza wa Jall's sovereignty. The Prophet, upon whom be peace, is a human and not a divine figure who's inherently immune to desires or the whispers of the devil. It is only by the protection of Allah that is he protected from these things. This also would serve as a detailed and exaggerated exegesis to gain attention that would interest people more into what was revealed in the Quran. So this fabricator may have heard the authentic narration and added some little spice to it in his eyes. The second thing is that even if we were to grant that it was embarrassing, why do we have to assume the person who fabricated this was truly a Muslim? Why couldn't it have been a munafiq, so a hypocrite who portrays himself as a Muslim but inside does not believe? In this possibility, he would have hated the authentic narration, which had them prostrating in all of the Quran alone, and not because the Prophet recited these verses. Seems like Harvard's dropped their standards.
Admitting that the Prophet of Islam could mistakenly recite words inspired by Satan doesn't just raise a few eyebrows. It threatens to unravel the very foundation of Islam itself. But what's fascinating is that this wasn't always the case. According to Shahab Ahmed, in Before Orthodoxy, the rejection of the Satanic verses incident is a modern phenomenon. He writes this, quote, "The fundamental finding of this present volume is that in the first 2 centuries of Islam, Muslim attitudes to the Satanic verses incident were effectively the direct opposite of what they are today. This volume studies no less than 50 historical reports that narrate the Satanic verses incident and that were transmitted by the first generations of Muslims. This study of the Satanic verses incident in the historical memory of the early Muslim community will demonstrate in detail that the incident constituted an absolute standard element in the memory of early Muslims of the life of their prophet." In other words, for the first 200 years of Islam, this incident wasn't just accepted, it was universally recognized by the earliest Muslims as part of Muhammad's life story.
So what is it? Do we have many people transmitting it early on and they all universally accepted it with no controversy? And this is merely a modern phenomena of people being embarrassed of it? Or were they embarrassed of it and therefore wouldn't want to spread this story and deemed it as inauthentic? You can't have your cake and eat it, dude. Like, this is getting embarrassing at this point for this guy.
It wasn't until centuries later, as Islam expanded and sought to solidify its claims to perfection, that the story became a theological liability.
Cameron makes this claim that during the Abbasid Caliphate, that's when it started to get problematic. However, we have someone within the first 2 generations of Muslims that did reject it based on it being theologically problematic. We have here Hassan al-Basri, died in the early time of the 2nd century. And yet again, this very simple detail is found in the very book that Cameron was holding.
In Before Orthodoxy, Ahmed explains that this event is recorded in no fewer than 50 sources, many of them independent, and all from within early Islamic tradition. What's more, this story passes the historical criterion of embarrassment. No one invents a tale that damages their own cause. The fact that early Muslims recorded a story so damaging to Muhammad's credibility, combined with the fact that it shows up in multiple independent sources, makes it more plausible than not that this event actually happened.
Yeah, like I mentioned before, it's very clear that Cameron never actually read the book, because the whole point of the book is to show that it was something seen to be normative early on. So his main point was about it not being theologically problematic for the early Muslims, which directly contradicts what Cameron's saying about them finding it embarrassing.